In July of 2000, a company called Nortel Networks is worth more than $250 billion. It employs 94,500 people across the globe, and it accounts for 35% of the total value of every company listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. One company, a third of a nation's entire market. At its headquarters on Moody Drive in Ottawa, a sprawling campus of 11 interconnected buildings, engineers design the switches and fiber optic systems that carry, by most accounts, 3/4 of North America's internet traffic. The Nortel sign on that campus is visible for miles. By September of 2002, the stock trades at 63 Canadian cents. 99% of the value is gone. 60,000 jobs have been erased in under 2 years. The story of how a mechanical workshop in Montreal became the most valuable company in Canadian history and then became nothing begins in 1880. You're watching Empire Circuit, where we take apart the companies that built the electronic world, down to the circuit board and the engineer who designed it. This is the story of a company that once routed most of a continent's data, the engineers who made it possible, and the executives who lost everything they built. If that's your kind of story, subscribe and hit like, because the rise here is just as strange as the fall. In 1880, 4 years after Alexander Graham Bell patented the telephone, the Bell Telephone Company of Canada was founded. It needed equipment. It could not build its own. On July 24, 1882, Bell Canada created a mechanical department in Montreal with a staff of 3. They built telephone equipment by hand, working under license from Western Electric in the United States. Canada's entire telephone infrastructure depended on American designs, American parts, American permission. The department grew to 11 workers, then to 54, then outgrew its space entirely. But it remained what it was, a workshop inside a utility, assembling other people's inventions for a domestic market. The country that would one day build the digital switch that outperformed AT&T had not yet built anything original of its own. That gap between dependence and invention would take decades to close, and when it finally closed, it would close faster than anyone in the industry believed possible. By December of 1895, the workshop would have a name. On December 7, 1895, the Northern Electric and Manufacturing Company was incorporated under Dominion Charter in Montreal, Quebec. CFC's was its first president. The company existed for one purpose: manufacturing telephone equipment for Bell Canada. For the next half-century, it built under license from Western Electric, producing telephones, switchboards, and cable for a regulated monopoly. It also made consumer goods: radios, television sets, console phonographs. Northern Electric was a steady, undramatic manufacturer, content to follow rather than lead. Then, the 1949 antitrust settlement forced Western Electric to divest its stake. Northern Electric was, for the first time, on its own. It had the manufacturing capacity, the workforce, and the customer base. What it did not have was a single original idea worth betting a company on. That would take 22 more years and a research lab on the outskirts of Ottawa. Through the 1960s, Northern Electric continued building other people's designs. The telephone industry was analog, deliberate, resistant to change. AT&T had publicly planned to delay the transition to digital switching until the 1990s. But in 1971, Northern Electric and Bell Canada merged their research and development operations into a new entity called Bell Northern Research, headquartered on the Carling campus in Ottawa. B&R's engineers began working on what they internally called the E-Thing, an experimental electronic switching system. By late 1972, they had the SG-1, an electronically controlled private branch exchange. Within 3 years, 6,000 units had been sold. But the SG-1 was a halfway measure, still analog at its core. The engineers knew that digital switching was not merely an improvement, it was an inevitability. The rest of the industry said it was too expensive and too early. B&R's engineers did not argue. They built the proof instead. In 1975, B&R introduced the SL-1. It was the world's first all-digital private branch exchange, fully digital in both control and switching, built on an architecture the engineers called stored logic. The man most responsible for driving the digital vision was David Weiss, an electrical engineer who would spend 37 years at the company. The Globe and Mail would later call him the best CEO Northern Telecom never had, instrumental in creating the technology that changed how phone calls were connected, even as AT&T opposed the idea entirely. In February of 1976, Northern Electric rebranded itself as Northern Telecom and staged its Digital World announcement at Walt Disney World in Orlando, unveiling a complete family of digital products. The industry thought they were reckless. They were exactly fast enough. By 1977, the DMS-10, a digital switch for small central offices, was deployed. 2 years later came the DMS-100, capable of handling 100,000 telephone lines, the first commercially successful Class 5 digital switch in the public telephone network. Northern Telecom did not wait for AT&T's permission. That same willingness to stake everything on one conviction would return a generation later, under very different leadership, with very different results. But first, the DMS-100 had American soil to conquer. In 1984, the breakup of AT&T fractured the Bell system into regional companies that could, for the first time, buy equipment from suppliers other than Western Electric. Northern Telecom walked through the open door with the DMS-100. AT&T rushed out the 5 ESS switch in response. By 1990, Northern Telecom held close to a third of the American digital switch market. Revenue crossed $5 billion. Weiss's teams helped install MCI's National Underground Fiber Optic Cable Network. A Canadian company, born as a parts supplier for a domestic utility, had out-engineered the largest telecommunications enterprise on Earth. Many observers would later say that pushing Weiss to the sidelines during the executive power struggles of the late 1980s was one of the worst mistakes the company ever made. You can read Northern Telecom's rise two ways, and honest history requires both. Either it was a triumph of genuine engineering vision, or it was the temporary advantage of a company that moved early on a technology everyone would eventually adopt. The internet was arriving. It would demand a second bet. By the mid-1990s, Nortel equipment carried roughly 3/4 of North America's internet traffic. The SL1 had made the company the world's largest supplier of private branch exchanges. DMS-100 switches sat in central offices across the continent, routing millions of calls daily, running on Protel, a programming language BNR's engineers designed from scratch because nothing else met their standards. Ottawa had earned the nickname Silicon Valley North. In the year 2000, the Ottawa region had 1,000 technology companies employing 75,000 people, 1 in 5 of those workers belonging to Nortel. If you held a PhD in engineering in Canada, the odds were 1 in 3 that Nortel hired you. The SL1 was not merely a product. It was the proof that a Canadian research lab could build something no one else in the world had built. Stored logic meant the entire switching architecture ran in software, not in relays and crossbar assemblies. It was smaller. It was faster. It was upgradable in ways electromechanical systems could never be. The SL1 evolved into the Meridian 1, then the CS1000, and its descendants ran in private networks around the world for decades. The DMS-100 deserves a longer one. It integrated switching and transmission into a single digital platform, and it forced the largest telecommunications company in history to react to a competitor it had never taken seriously. DMS-100 switches, deployed in the early 1980s, are still running today, maintained by Ribbon Communications. The machines outlived the company that built them by more than a decade. Then John Roth became CEO in October of 1997. He had joined Northern Telecom in 1969 as a design engineer. But the CEO who emerged was not building switches. He was buying companies. More than $22 billion in acquisitions, Bay Networks for $9.1 billion in stock, 16 companies in fiber optics alone, 1 new acquisition per month. The currency was Nortel's own stock, and the stock was climbing because the revenue was climbing, because the customers were spending, because the bubble was inflating. Every purchase was paid for with paper, whose value depended on the next quarter meeting the last quarter's promise. Time magazine called Roth the most successful businessman in modern Canadian history. The engineers who had built the DMS 100 watched an executive class spend decades of credibility on companies they had never inspected from the inside. The stock was the currency. The stock was the bet. And the bet was about to break. The dot-com bubble burst. Telecommunications carriers discovered that only 7 to 15% of the fiber they had installed was actually carrying traffic. The overcapacity was staggering. Nortel's revenue fell by half. The stock dropped 20 to 33% in single trading sessions, and the Toronto Stock Exchange crashed repeatedly under the volume of sell orders its systems could not process. In the fall of 2000, a Bay Street panel named Roth Canada's CEO of the Year. He resigned in April of 2001. He left with an estimated $139 million. The mechanism of failure was precise. He had confused buying companies with building them, confused paper with product, confused the stock price with the company underneath it. When the bubble burst, both sides of every acquisition collapsed at once. But the crash was not the worst of it. The worst was what happened to the books. Frank Dunn, the former chief financial officer, took over as CEO in November of 2001. He cut the workforce from 94,500 to roughly 35,000 in under 2 years. 60,000 people lost their jobs. Then the accounting scandal surfaced. Nortel restated its financial results for 2000, 2001, and 2002. The Securities and Exchange Commission alleged the company had overstated revenue to create the impression it was outperforming competitors during the worst of the downturn. Dunn and 2 other executives were fired in 2004, charged with fraud in 2008, and acquitted in 2013 when the court ruled the Crown had failed to meet the standard of proof. Meanwhile, Brian Shields, a senior systems security advisor, discovered that hackers traced to Shanghai had been inside Nortel's network since approximately 2000, using stolen executive passwords to download research and business plans. Shields reported the breach. Management did not act. Huawei has denied any connection, and a University of Ottawa study attributed the fall to management failures. The documented record holds both readings. On January 14, 2009, Nortel filed for bankruptcy protection, the largest corporate failure in Canadian history. 20,000 Canadian pensioners saw their defined benefits cut. Between 2009 and 2016, Nortel executives collected $190 million in retention bonuses. The pensioners rallied on Parliament Hill in Ottawa. The executives collected their checks. The assets were sold, piece by piece. They sold the enterprise division to Avaya for $900 million. They sold the wireless business to Ericsson. They sold the optical networking assets to Ciena. They sold the patent portfolio, 6,000 patents, to a consortium of Apple, Microsoft, Ericsson, Sony, BlackBerry, and EMC for $4.5 billion. In total, the auctions recovered roughly $7.3 billion. A company once worth more than $250 billion was stripped to the frame and sold for parts. But the building was still standing. The Carling campus, 207,000 square meters, sold to the Canadian government for $208 million. The Department of National Defense moved in, where engineers once designed the switches that routed a continent's telephone calls. Military administrators now occupy the same hallways. DMS 100 switches still run in networks across North America, maintained long after the company that built them ceased to exist. The 6,000 patents, purchased by Apple, Microsoft, Ericsson, Sony, and BlackBerry, are embedded in devices those companies sell today. Every modern smartphone, every fiber optic backbone, every data packet that crosses the continent carries some fragment of what Nortel's engineers designed on Moody Drive. The engineers' work outlived the company by decades. The executives' acquisitions are worth nothing. The machines were the honest part. The sign is gone from the Carling campus now. If you drive past 60 Moody Drive in Ottawa's West End, you will see a defense headquarters where 8,500 military and civilian employees work in buildings designed for engineers who are no longer there. The technology those engineers built is everywhere, inside every call, every packet, every network on the continent, running quietly under other companies' names and inside other companies' patents. The engineers bet on digital and built a giant. The executives bet on everything else and buried it. If you worked at Nortel, worked on a DMS switch, or watched Silicon Valley North hollow out, drop a comment below. Tell us the division, the years, and whether you saw it coming. The people who built these systems, and the people who lost their pensions when the company failed them, know more about what was lost than the people who cashed out before the fall. We have the story of another tech empire coming next, and you will not want to miss how it ends.